Hey everyone, ready to dive into speaking practice? We're taking inspiration from Learn English with Mr. Concord, the power of speaking practice. I think whether you're a beginner or pretty advanced, there's something here for you.
It's wild how much we stress over grammar and vocab sometimes and totally forget about just speaking.
It's so true. We forget why we're learning in the first place, right?
Yeah. And this episode really hits on that. Speaking is where fluency comes to life, It's how you go from knowing English to actually using it.
Totally. So let's break it down. Why is speaking practice so important? What's happening in our brains when we speak?
So every time you speak English, you're kind of rewiring your brain, You're building these pathways that let you think in English, not just translate from your native language.
Oh.
There's actual research on it. It's called neuroplasticity. That's how your brain changes and adapts. So every time you hesitate or make a mistake, you're actually learning.
That's awesome. So we're basically shaping our brains with every conversation.
Exactly. And those pathways get more efficient the more you practice and you start to speak more naturally and, just more easily. It's like learning an instrument. The more you practice, the smoother it gets. And you can focus on the music, not fumbling with the keys.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Oh.
Okay, so speaking practice is key. But let's be real. Speaking a new language can be scary. We've all been there, right? That fear of messing up or sounding silly.
Oh, for sure. It's totally natural to feel that way. It's like being on stage for the first time, all eyes are on you.
Totally. But the episode has some good advice on beating that fear. One thing that stood out was embracing mistakes. We all know it's important, but how do we actually feel good about making mistakes?
I think it's all about shifting our perspective, Instead of seeing mistakes as failures, what if we saw them as feedback? Every mistake gets you closer to fluency. Yeah. There's actually a thing called error-based learning where you practice the things you usually mess up on to learn faster.
So instead of avoiding mistakes, we should look for them. That's a pretty different way to think about it.
It might sound weird, but the research is there. When you focus on your errors, your brain has to pay attention and adjust.
That makes sense. It's like if you're learning basketball, you don't just keep shooting the same way over and over. You figure out what you're doing wrong and fix it.
Exactly. And in language learning, those mistakes show you what you need to practice more.
Makes sense. Okay, so mistakes are good. But what about when we're practicing alone and there's no one to correct us? Any tips for solo practice?
Well, the episode talks about the classic talk to yourself strategy. It might sound strange, but it really works.
I've totally done that. Sometimes I catch myself narrating my whole day in English, even if I'm just doing normal stuff.
See? It might seem silly, but it gets you comfortable making sentences without the pressure of someone listening.
So we should basically be having conversations with ourselves.
It doesn't have to be that intense. Just describe what you're doing, what you see, even your thoughts and feelings. The point is to get your brain working in English.
Like giving your inner voice an English accent. Okay, so we've covered why speaking is important and how to get over making mistakes. But what about the how? What are some practical things we can do to improve?
Finding a language partner is always a good idea. Having regular conversations is so valuable because you're using English in a real context.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be super formal. It could be a friend, a coworker, or someone online. The key is to find someone you like talking to so it doesn't feel like work.
Exactly. The more you enjoy it, the more you'll do it. And real conversations are where you really start to get fluent and deal with those unexpected things that happen in real life.
So true. But what if you can't find a partner or aren't ready for full conversations yet? The episode mentioned shadowing, which sounded cool.
Oh, yeah. Shadowing is great for your pronunciation and intonation. You listen to native speakers like podcasts, audiobooks, TED Talks, and repeat what they're saying, trying to copy their rhythm and tone.
So like karaoke, but for talking.
Exactly. But instead of just singing along, you're focusing on how they pronounce things, their pauses, their emphasis. You're training your mouth and brain to make those sounds naturally.
I love it. Sounds fun and useful. It also makes me think about recording yourself speaking. Did they recommend that?
Oh, definitely. It might feel weird at first, but recording yourself is one of the best ways to become aware of how you sound. It lets you listen objectively, which can be really surprising.
The first time I listened to myself speaking English, I was horrified. I had no idea. I used so many filler words, and my sentences were so choppy.
It happens to everyone. But that's why recordings are good. They show you those habits you don't even realize you have. Then you can actually fix them.
Like a free language coach.
Exactly. And you can see how much you've improved over time by listening to old recordings.
So we've got language partners shadowing and recording ourselves. What about all the apps out there?
Right. There are tons of apps specifically for speaking practice. From AI chatbots to games and pronunciation tools, there's so much out there.
I love that they give you a low-pressure way to practice. You can try things out, make mistakes, and get feedback without feeling embarrassed.
Exactly. It's like a safe space to play with the language and build your confidence. And a lot of them use games and stuff to make learning more fun.
And before we go any further, the episode we're looking at had a Q&A section, which I thought was super helpful. Want to tackle some of those questions?
Sure. Let's hear them.
All right, first one. I don't have anyone to practice with. What's the best way to get speaking practice when you're alone?
That's a common problem. We've already talked about some of the things like talking to yourself and using apps, but AI-powered language bots are getting really popular too.
Oh, yeah. Those chatbots are getting so good. I've tried a few, and it feels so natural talking to them.
It's crazy, right? It's not exactly the same as talking to a person, but it's a good way to get extra practice when you don't have a partner.
And they're available 24/7, so you can practice anytime.
Yep. And a lot of them give you personalized feedback and adjust to how you learn, which is helpful.
All right, here's another. I get so embarrassed when I make mistakes speaking. How can I get over that fear and just be more confident? I think we've all been there.
Definitely. It's normal to feel self-conscious, especially when you're speaking a new language.
It's like being back in high school giving a presentation and everyone's staring at you.
I know, right? But you gotta remember, everyone makes mistakes. Even native speakers mess up sometimes. It's just part of being human.
And if you're talking to other language learners, they're probably more worried about their own mistakes than yours.
Exactly. We tend to overthink our mistakes, but the people you're talking to are probably just as understanding as you would be.
So how can we stop feeling so embarrassed about making mistakes?
I think it starts with accepting that mistakes are part of learning. You can't learn to ride a bike without falling a few times, right? Same thing with language learning. Each mistake helps you grow.
The more you fall, the better you get at getting back up.
Exactly. And remember, making mistakes actually makes you learn faster. When you make a mistake and get corrected or even correct yourself, you remember the right way better.
So we should celebrate mistakes as part of the learning process.
Totally. Every mistake means you're pushing yourself, trying new things, and getting closer to your goal.
I love that. Okay, so we need to embrace mistakes. But are there any other mindset changes we can make to be more confident speakers?
Focusing on the process, not just the outcome, can help. Instead of stressing about speaking perfectly right away, just focus on enjoying the conversation.
So it's more about connecting with someone and expressing yourself than being perfect.
Yes. When you stop trying to be perfect, you can relax, have fun, and learn more effectively.
That makes sense. And I bet you'll sound more confident to the other person too.
Absolutely. When you're relaxed and enjoying the conversation, your personality comes through. And that's what makes you an interesting speaker, no matter your level.
All right, so we've talked about why speaking practice is important, how to get over the fear of making mistakes, and some practical ways to get started. But before we wrap up this part, something really interested me in the episode, deliberate practice. It sounds like a total game changer.
Definitely. Deliberate practice is more than just putting in the time. It's about being intentional and strategic with your practice.
So it's not just chatting away in English.
Nope. It's about setting goals, breaking down skills into smaller chunks, and focusing on what you need to improve the most.
I see how that could be a game changer. Can you give us an example? Like, what would deliberate practice look like for someone who wants to be more fluent?
Sure. Let's say you struggle with using phrasal verbs naturally. Instead of just hoping you'll eventually get it, you could make a list of common ones, practice using them to record yourself, and then see how you did.
So find your weaknesses and really focus on them.
Exactly. And get feedback from a partner, a teacher, or by listening to yourself.
It sounds like you need to be really self-aware and disciplined.
You do. But it's worth it. You learn faster and make more progress.
I'm convinced. But before we get too deep into deliberate practice, let's take a break and we'll pick up the conversation in part 2 of our deep dive.
Welcome back. So ready to talk more about deliberate practice.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by this idea of practicing smarter, not just harder, but I think it helps to have some examples. What does this actually look like?
Okay, so let's say you're getting ready to give a presentation in English. Deliberate practice would be breaking it down into smaller parts, practicing each part carefully, and even recording yourself to see how you sound.
So instead of just going for it, you're actually rehearsing and getting better.
Exactly. You might notice some things you need to work on, like moving between slides smoothly, using your body language more, or telling stories to make it interesting.
Like when a musician practices scales or an athlete works on their footwork, they're practicing those basic skills to get better overall.
Right. And another part of deliberate practice is asking for feedback from someone you trust, a language partner, or even just listening to your own recordings.
That feedback is so important, isn't it? It's like having a mirror showing you what you might be doing wrong without realizing it.
Totally. And what's cool is you can use deliberate practice for any part of language learning, whether it's grammar, vocab, pronunciation, or even listening. There are techniques that can help.
I'm getting really excited about this. It feels like we can actually control how we learn. But I do have one question. Doesn't deliberate practice sound kind of exhausting? Like, it's good to be focused, but do we have to be serious all the time? Can't we have fun too?
That's a good point. Deliberate practice does take effort, but it shouldn't be boring. I actually think the best learners find ways to make it fun and interesting.
So how do we balance being focused with enjoying the process and staying motivated?
One thing is to choose activities and topics you're actually interested in. You're more likely to want to learn and practice if you're passionate about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like if you're learning English because you love movies, use those movies to practice. Maybe you could write down your favorite scenes, practice shadowing the actors, or even act out the dialogue with a partner.
Exactly. And another way to keep it fun is to try different things. Don't be afraid to experiment with different techniques, apps, and resources. The more variety, the better.
So it's all about finding what works for you, what keeps you excited about learning.
Yeah. And remember, even doing a little bit consistently makes a big difference over time. Rome wasn't built in a day, right? Learning a language is a marathon, not a sprint.
Okay, that's good to hear. Can we connect this back to the episode we're talking about? Did they have any tips that fit with this idea of deliberate practice?
For sure. They talked about spaced repetition, which is perfect for deliberate practice. Have you heard of that?
Maybe. It sounds familiar, but can you explain it again?
Of course. So with spaced repetition, you review things you're learning at longer and longer intervals. So instead of cramming a bunch of new words and then forgetting them, you come back to them at specific times to help you remember.
So it's like working out a muscle. You work it out, then give it time to rest before working it out again.
Exactly. And there are apps and programs that can help you use spaced repetition for learning vocab and grammar. They keep track of what you're learning and remind you when to review.
That sounds super useful. It takes the guesswork out of it. And speaking of helpful tools, the episode also talked about using technology to practice speaking, which I think is great for people who don't have partners or classes.
Absolutely. Technology has opened up so many possibilities for language learners. We already talked about AI chatbots, but there are also apps that connect you with language partners all over the world so you can have conversations online.
Oh yeah, I've heard of those. It's like a language exchange, but you don't have to be in the same place.
Exactly. And a lot of these apps have video chat, texting, and voice recording so you can practice different things and get feedback from native speakers.
It's amazing how easy it is to connect with people and practice languages now. And I think it's especially great for people who might feel isolated or don't have access to traditional ways of learning.
I totally agree. It's made language learning so much more accessible.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of practical tips. But before we wrap up this part, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, the fear of making mistakes. It's such a big thing for language learners, and I think it deserves more attention.
You're right. It's important to remember that feeling nervous or self-conscious is completely normal. It's part of stepping outside your comfort zone and trying to grow.
It's like if you're not a little bit nervous, you're probably not challenging yourself enough.
Love that. And try to think of those nerves as excitement. It means you're about to do something challenging and rewarding.
So instead of, oh no, I'm going to mess up, it's, yes, this is a chance to learn.
Exactly. And remember, every mistake gets you closer to fluency.
I'm feeling inspired. But what are some things we can do to calm our nerves and be more confident? Like any practical tips?
One simple thing is to pay attention to your breathing. When we get nervous, we tend to breathe quickly and shallowly, which actually makes us feel more anxious.
So taking deep breaths can help?
Absolutely. Deep, slow breaths tell your body that everything is okay.
Like a pause button for your anxiety.
Exactly. And another good strategy is positive self-talk. Instead of focusing on what could go wrong, try to think positive thoughts.
So instead of, I'm going to mess this up, it's, I'm doing my best and that's all that matters.
Exactly. And if you do make a mistake, don't get mad at yourself. Just acknowledge it, correct yourself if you can, and keep going. Remember, mistakes are part of learning.
These are really helpful tips. It's good to have these tools when we start feeling nervous.
Absolutely. And confidence comes with practice. The more you speak, the easier it gets.
So just like anything else, the more you do it, the less scary it is. And speaking of practice, I think we're ready for the last part of our deep dive where we'll talk about more resources and strategies for making speaking practice a regular habit.
Ready to go?
Let's do it. Okay, we're back for the last part of our deep dive into speaking practice. I'm feeling super motivated to use all these ideas. What about you?
Yeah, for sure. We've had a great conversation, and I think we found some really useful strategies for anyone who wants to be a more confident and fluent speaker.
Totally. We've talked about so much, from how our brains learn language to practical stuff like shadowing and deliberate practice. But before we wrap up, I want to talk about something we haven't mentioned much: mindset.
Oh yeah, mindset is huge in language learning. It can make the difference between feeling stuck or actually growing and enjoying the process.
So how can we change our mindset to be more successful? The episode talked about having a growth mindset, which I think is super important.
Definitely. A growth mindset means believing that you can always improve your abilities. It's about loving challenges, seeing mistakes as opportunities, and not giving up when things get hard.
So instead of saying, I'm not good at speaking, you say, I'm learning to speak and I'm getting better every day.
Exactly. That little change can make a big difference in how motivated you are and in how much you learn.
It's about focusing on the journey, not just the destination.
Right. And another thing is to be curious and playful. Language learning shouldn't be a chore. It should be an adventure, a chance to express yourself in new ways and connect with people.
I love that. It's like remembering how much fun it is to learn something new.
Yes. When you're playful, you're more likely to experiment, take risks, and have fun, which actually helps you learn faster.
Okay, so mindset is key.
Yeah.
But what about resources? What are some specific things you recommend for people who want to really improve their speaking?
Besides the apps, some online stuff we talked about, I think it's important to find ways to use English in real life. Maybe join a conversation group, go to language exchange events, or volunteer somewhere you can use your English.
Those are great ideas. It's about getting out there and actually using your skills with real people.
Exactly. And don't forget about immersion. If you can travel to an English-speaking country or even just surround yourself with English at home, like watching movies, listening to music, and reading books, it'll help you so much.
Like letting the language soak into your brain.
Yeah. The more you're exposed to English, the more natural it'll feel to speak.
Okay, we've covered so much in this deep dive. We've explored the science behind speaking practice, talked about challenges, and found some really helpful strategies. But before we go, I want to leave everyone with one last thing to think about.
Ooh, I like that. What if we ask them to think about their why? Why are they learning to speak English? What are their goals? What do they want to achieve?
That's such a powerful question. When we know why we're doing something, it gives us motivation and helps us keep going, even when it's tough.
Absolutely. When you have a clear purpose, it's easier to stay focused, motivated, and keep practicing, even when it's challenging.
So whether you want to travel the world, connect with family, get a better job, or just learn something new, let that reason be your guide.
And remember, learning a language never really ends. There will always be more to learn, new challenges and new things to achieve.
But the rewards are incredible. Being able to communicate in another language opens up so many doors. You can connect with people from different cultures, see things from new perspectives, and really experience the world in a whole new way.
So keep practicing, keep learning, and keep believing in yourself. The world is waiting to hear what you have to say.
That's perfect. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks so much for joining us. Until next time, keep those conversations going.